Hey, welcome to my channel. My name is Sarah. If you're new here, I'm currently in nursing school. I'm 26, I'll be 27 in a few days. I am a mom of two, I'm married, and I just finished all my prereqs for my nursing program this past spring semester. I did finish with a 4.0, so I feel like these tips really help me, especially when it comes to anatomy and physiology. Anatomy and physiology is unlike any class that you're gonna take, at least at the beginning of your college journey, especially if you haven't already taken a science class. My program, there was two parts to anatomy and physiology. We had the lecture and lab, and it really felt like you were taking two classes in one. I had a different professor for lecture and a different professor for lab. So to me, it felt like I was taking two classes, even though on paper you're taking one. I'm gonna share how I studied for lecture and how I studied for lab, because it really is like two different study methods. You're getting tested differently for each one, at least that's how my program did it. So I studied very differently for lecture versus how I studied for lab. Lecture was always 75% of my grade, so with all three biology classes, I did Anatomy and Physiology 1, Anatomy and Physiology 2, and Microbiology. Lecture was always 75% of my grade, and lab was 25. I'm really bad at mental math, but lab was 25% of my grade, so lecture really mattered, and lecture was the physiology part, how things worked, and lab was simply the anatomy and being able to label body parts. What I would start with was reverse learning, and if you don't know what that is, it is going over the material prior to your class or lecture and basically teaching yourself. I wasn't really intense with that part of it. I would basically get the PowerPoint or whatever material that our professors had already handed out, and I would skim. I would like make sure to look at the big picture of what we were going to go over in lecture and basically just kind of get an idea ahead of time. So I have never had a class where I didn't already have some kind of material at least a few days before lecture or whatever. So I was always able to look ahead and get an idea and a sense of what we were going to be going over in lecture. So then once I was actually in lecture, I wasn't completely lost. Most of the time I was still lost, but I had some kind of idea of what we were going to go over. And then what I would do in lecture is then I would have that material on my iPad already. While my professor was teaching, I was writing on the PowerPoints that I had in Notability, and I'll show you that in a minute, but I would be taking notes on the PowerPoints or whatever material that our professor had given us prior. So this is kind of an example. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but this is a PowerPoint that I was able to directly download into Notability, and I would go through while my professor was teaching and I would take notes right on the PowerPoint. At this point, I've seen the material twice, and then after that lecture or whatnot, then I would make my own outline of what we went over in class from the notes that I made on the PowerPoint or other materials. And this would be a pretty in-depth overview and outline of what we were going over. And then at this point, anything that I wasn't getting, or if I was writing it down and it was like completely going in one ear and out the other, then I would turn to things like YouTube. And one of my favorite YouTubers for anatomy and physiology is Ninja Nerd. I always got great information from them. They go from the ground up. So I'm the type of learner where I really need to start at the ground and work my way up to understand the bigger picture of things. Most of my professors would hand out study guides. So about a week prior to the test, that's when I would turn to the study guide and whatever they gave out for the test, and I would go over and make another outline basically just for the study guide. And this is generally a more condensed version of the outlines that I had already taken for those chapters that's going to be on the test. And I would use the red, yellow, green light method for my study guide. So what this is when you go through your study guide, you highlight in green, like you know that there's no question about it. You have it down good. You can answer any questions about it. Yellow, something that you're kind of iffy on. And then red is like, I have no idea what this is and I really need to go back over that. So that's what I would use when it came to preparing for the test. And I'll show you what the red, yellow, green light method is. I use my iPad for everything. This is a study guide that I was going over, and you can see where I marked things in green or yellow or red, and then I would go back in and go over those things. A lot of red here. But that really helped me kind of get a feel for what I was good on and what I needed to go back over. And this is when I would make flashcards for lecture. I would make flashcards at the end of whatever unit we were going over and right before our test. And I would only make flashcards for the things I was still struggling on. So that's kind of what I would do for lecture. Again, I would do reverse learning and get a little glimpse of what we were going to go over prior to lecture. I'd take notes during lecture. I'd do my own notes outline of what we went over in lecture, and then I would do the red, yellow, green light method when it came to my study guide and do a more condensed outline note version for that study guide a week prior to my test, and do any flashcards or make any flashcards for whatever I was not getting when it came to those last few days right before the test. And one thing that really helped me was making sure that I could answer a question in basically any form that you could ask me about a topic in several different ways, and I would be able to answer that because I understood what I was reading and learning. I understood and grasped the concept of what it is that we were going over. You cannot memorize everything when it comes to anatomy and physiology. You can use memorization when it comes to labeling body parts and things like that, but as far as lecture goes, you really do need to understand the concepts that you're going over and make sure that you have a good grasp on the lecture and physiology portion of the course. For lab, it was only 25% of my grade, so it still counts, every point counts, but I was able to breathe a little bit more when it came to lab. Now, the thing with lab in my program was spelling counts, and if you missed a word by one letter, it was 50%. If you missed a word by 2 letters, you got the answer completely wrong. So making sure that you could spell whatever it was that you needed to label was crucial. What I would do is both of my anatomy and physiology classes, they were very good about giving objectives. This is what you could be asked about, so you need to be able to label this part of the body or whatever it was. Now, they would give an objective list that was like 200 words long, and you could, be asked only like 25 of those on a quiz or test, but you needed to make sure that you could spell and identify all 200 of those words or body parts. Again, I'm big on the iPad, so what I would do is I would first get the list of objectives or the list of words that we were going to be tested on or that we could be tested on, and I would focus on spelling first. So I would make a list in Notability, and I would use the tape feature. I'll show you that in a minute. And I would tape over all of the words, and then I would try to spell them out. Gosh, I could probably do this 100 times. Spelling is not my strong suit, so it was very important that I was able to spell these things. I took it very seriously, and I was constantly running through my spelling list and making sure that I could spell these words. And I would spell out those words until I was dreaming about them. There were so many nights I'd go to sleep and I was dreaming about left ventricle, right ventricle, heart stuff, brain anatomy. So I spelled these words until I could spell them backwards and forwards and had no problem. Then I would go to the models or the pictures that our professors gave us, and I would use the tape feature again, and I would write out the word for the body part and I'd tape over it, and I'd make sure that I could go back in and identify that part of the body and that I could spell it correctly. I would do this over and over and over again until it was kind of ridiculous. Now, with spelling and identifying the parts of the body, when it came to models, we were tested on the actual anatomy, real images, and also plastic models. So I was doing both plastic models and real life models in terms of practicing. And I would also do different angles of the body parts, because sometimes they'll give you cross sections or the left view versus the right view. And again, the same thing with the spelling and the same thing with lecture. I wanted to be able to be given any picture of any body part at any angle, at any cross section or cut, and be able to identify what I was looking at and spell it correctly. I have a little friend here. His name is Jorge. So I did end up ordering a few things off of Amazon to help with memorizing and being able to identify parts of the body. I learn from the ground up, and I learn best if I can see and feel and all of that kind of stuff. So having like an actual model that I can see and touch and feel and identify what I need to really was beneficial for me. Now, my little friend, he had a craniotomy. He has lost the top part of his skull. So I don't know what happened with that, but I only used him for about 2 weeks, and he kind of just sits on my desk now, and he's cute, so I like that. But oh no, I need to impale him again. There we go. Yeah, this is really good when we were going over the bones and things like that. Bones, it's not just like, you know, what's this bone? It's very in depth of what is this part of the bone, what is this feature of this part of the bone. It gets very in depth, so you need to be able to get down to the nitty gritty and identify and spell all of those types of things. That was just a little tool that I added in to help me with identifying and being able to spell parts of the body when it came to bones. This is just an example of a list of words that my professor would give me. So that's that tape tool that I was talking about. So I would tape over it, spell it beside it, and be able to tap on it to see if I spelled it right. And then I could tap over it and it would hide it again. That's where I would start and make sure that I could spell the list of words. The next part for me, once I felt confident that I could spell all these words, would be to go in and label them when it came to the actual anatomy. So again, I would tape over them and make sure that I could spell them. I would write beside it. The image I just showed you was of a plastinated heart, but it really tripped me up. That was a huge one. I just really could not get the left and right side down because of the way they cut it. So that's one of the things that I kind of struggled with, that I would really like go over and make sure that I knew. I would get a different image of a plastinated heart from another site or Google or whatever and make sure that I had that down. In the end, I wasn't even tested on it. They didn't even show a plastinated heart on my test, so I got lucky with that. I made sure that I knew everything they told me that I could be tested on and that I could spell it and identify it no matter what. So that's how I studied for lab. It's very different from lecture. I really went in depth with lecture. I made sure that I could understand concepts and use critical thinking when it came to being tested on lecture, and lab was definitely more memorization heavy. Anatomy and physiology is hard because it was just so different than all of my other classes. With anatomy and physiology, you go to lecture, you have tests and quizzes, you go to lab, you have tests and quizzes, and it was like 2 classes in one. So getting used to that and can be a little difficult for you in the beginning. You really have to apply yourself. You really have to put in the time. I spent a good amount of time for this class, and that means going to lecture, which could be 2 hours, coming home and spending an hour or 2 every day making notes on what you learned in lecture, and then going to lab, which is an hour or 2, and making notes for lab, which can be another hour or 2. It's so much better if you put in the time and work now versus having to retake the class and having a bad grade on your transcript, especially when it comes to financial aid and things like that. So my recommendation is to kind of embrace the suck, just get through it, put in the time, put in the work. That way it's done and over with and you're moving on and you're not having to retake it again. Me personally, my nursing program was very competitive, so I wanted to basically get an A, maybe B, but mostly A in all of my math and science classes to make sure I could get into the semester that I wanted to get into versus having to get on a wait list that was about 2 years long. I really needed to get an A, and I was able to do that, and I really think it was due to everything that I just mentioned. I can't stress this enough. You really do have to learn and understand how you study the best and how you learn the best and be consistent. Another thing that I did was play music in the background, but it was like alpha waves. It wasn't like radio. It was very calm study music, and I put that on every single time I studied without fail. So it was kind of like training my brain. Whenever I heard that, it was like, okay, it's study time, and it helped me like get in the mode of getting into studying and getting ready to take in a bunch of information. One of my last tips, and probably my biggest tips, is kind of knowing when you need a break, making sure that you know when your limits are. I had to learn the hard way, unfortunately. It was finals week this past Christmas, and I ended up in the hospital with some funky heart stuff going on. So you really need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and taking breaks when you need them. You'll do great. I promise. Just apply yourself and put in the work now, and you'll be fine. With any course and basically any professor, things are gonna shift. So you kind of have to be able to be flexible and go with the flow of things and be ready to kind of change and morph the way that you learn and study a little bit to match the type of professor you get with the type of class you get and the type of content you're learning. If you're currently taking anatomy and physiology, let me know in the comments below. If you have any questions, or if you're struggling, or if you have any other tips, drop them down below. Thank you so much for watching. That's all I have for you guys today.